Hello, everybody. Welcome to the event. We're going to wait just a minute or two as folks continue to join, so hang tight. Alrighty, we're getting close to a critical mass, so I'm going to go ahead and fire it up. We've got a great event today. Thanks for joining. We're hosted by the Strada Education Network, and the event is titled How to Help Americans Get Back to Work. I'm Paul Fain, a former longtime editor and reporter with Inside Higher Ed and a senior fellow with Strada Center for Education Consumer Insights. I don't need to tell all of you that the pandemic has dramatically worsened inequity in this country, with millions of workers losing jobs and wages, and the worst effects being disproportionately felt by Black, Latino, and lower income Americans. Much of the job loss may be permanent, as COVID and the recession also are speeding up anticipated changes to the economy. As the McKinsey Global Institute estimated in a report last week, the pandemic has accelerated existing trends in remote work, e-commerce, and automation, with up to 25% more workers than previously estimated, potentially needing to switch occupations. So for this event, we'll start with a rundown of newly released findings from Strada's public Viewpoint research, which is drawn from nationally representative surveys on public perceptions of employer practices and responsibilities on training, hiring, and talent development. In a minute, I'm going to turn to Andrew Hanson, Strada's Director of Research, who will describe the public Viewpoint findings. Then I'm excited to introduce two experts for a moderated discussion. Patti Constantakis, Director of Economic Opportunity for Walmart.org, the philanthropic arm of Walmart, which you may know is the world's largest employer. And then Martin Kurzweil, Director of the Educational Transformation Program at Ithaka S&R, a nonprofit research group. Just a little housekeeping here. After the discussion, I'll leave time for audience questions, but you can ask those questions now throughout the event using the Q&A tab you'll see at the bottom of your browser. Experts from Strada will be answering questions in the Q&A throughout the event, and I will direct some of them to Patti and Martin. Without further ado, let's turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Paul. And on behalf of Strada, welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. We continue to be in a crisis in which millions of Americans are struggling to find work. Between October and January, we added a net of only 100,000 jobs to the economy, which means we're still down 9 million jobs from our pre-pandemic peak and 13 million jobs from our pre-crisis trajectory. Paul alluded to some of this, but many of those jobs are not going to come back in the recovery for many reasons. Automation, for example, tends to accelerate in recessions. And this is why it is so critical to help workers reskill and upskill for the new and different jobs that are going to come back online. That's a central part of the solution of getting Americans back on their feet and back to work. 10 million Americans were unemployed as of January. More than half of those were long-term unemployed, which means that they've been out of work for at least 4 months. That includes 3 million workers who have a high school education or less, as well as 5.5 million who have less than a BA. As Paul mentioned, that includes a disproportionate share of Black Americans and Latinos. And so that's the context that brings us to this month's edition of the Public Viewpoint. Those of you who have been with us over the past 10 months will know that our topics have largely focused on understanding Americans' perspectives on education and training and work. But this month, we're going to shift gears and focus on employers and how they can help Americans get back to work, with an emphasis on hiring and facilitating that reskilling, upskilling, and advancement. A little housekeeping before we dig in. Our analysis this week is going to leverage 3 different survey instruments, which you see here. The first is our public viewpoint survey of 1,000 Americans 18 and older that was fielded in January. The public viewpoint, or excuse me, the 2020 Strada Gallup Education Consumer Survey of 23,000 Americans between the ages of 18 and 65, and then our Strada Gallup Employer Survey of 1,100 employees involved in hiring decisions. So we analyzed 2 topics. The first is Americans' perspectives on hiring and advancement. And there's some important context that I'd like to discuss before we get into the findings. We now have a job market in which we have too many workers chasing too few jobs, a slack labor market, which ultimately means that employers can become more selective. In the last recession, the Great Recession of 2008, employers elected to become more selective by increasing the requirements of college degrees for their job openings, especially bachelor's and graduate degrees. And we're now at a point where 3 in 4 new job postings require a bachelor's degree, even though 2 out of 3 workers in the job market don't have them. And so groups like Opportunity at Work, the Markle Foundation, and many others have been encouraging employers to drop the generic college degree requirements from their job openings in favor of skills-based hiring. And what they argue ultimately is that these generic degree requirements ultimately end up shutting out many of our most vulnerable citizens, including the disproportionate share of people of color, from opportunities that they are otherwise qualified for, except for the fact that they lack that degree or credential. Many cases they have the requisite skills, therefore can do the job, but because they don't have that degree, employers filter them out. And so we thought it would be valuable to ask the public's perspective on hiring, specifically with respect to opportunities for these skilled workers without degrees. So we asked our survey respondents whether they agreed or disagreed with these 2 statements. First, employers should hire job candidates who have skills and work experience, even if they don't have a degree. And second, in my field, employers actually do hire job candidates who have skills and work experience, but not a college degree. And what we see is that 69% of Americans agreed that employers should hire skilled workers without degrees, but less than half of them say that their employers actually do. And so, as I sort of mentioned, when employers acquire these generic bachelor's degrees, they're ultimately shutting 70% of Black Americans and 80% of Latinos from consideration whatsoever. So it may come as no surprise that Black Americans and Latinos are more likely to view our hiring and advancement systems as unfair. So last fall, we asked our survey respondents whether they felt that their opportunities to find a good job or advance at work were limited because either the system was unfair or they felt that there weren't opportunities for people who look like them. And what we found was that Black Americans and Latinos were substantially more likely to agree with those reasons compared to white Americans. And so over the past 2 years, my colleague, Holly Custard at Strada Institute has been interviewing dozens of adult learners to uplift their voices. And I now want to share with you a short clip from her interview with a gentleman named Rodney from Rhode Island, who really puts a pin in the challenge that we're facing.
And for the first time, the relevance of not having a degree became manifest, because even though I had years upon years, over 20 years of experience doing all these different things, the first question they were asking is, so where'd you go to school? The last time I actually had to go looking for a job, we did things like talk to people face to face, and that's completely gone now. And you just end up getting put into a slot, and as a result, they don't know who you are. They just look at, has he gone to school? No, so then you go into that pile.
And so even before the pandemic, we've heard from so many learners who are just saying that I know I can do this job if I just had the chance. So we have also asked both workers and employers about which factors are either very or extremely important in hiring and advancement through our 2018 Strada Gallup Employer Survey and our 2020 Strada Gallup Education Consumer Survey. And the results for that employer survey are on the left side of the screen there, and the results for the workers are on the right. And for workers, we asked them both about what mattered in getting their current job, as well as what matters for getting a raise, a promotion, or a new job. And we've put those factors into three big buckets: skills and work experience, which is, you see in green there; education, which is in the dark blue, and it includes things like education level, whether you have a college degree, whether you have a non-degree credential, your field of study, and your GPA. And then the last bucket is your professional network or other connections, which is in the light blue. And so first thing to say is, obviously education and skills are not mutually exclusive, they're complements. Degree and non-degree programs are a primary means through which people acquire skills, though it is often the case, that most of what workers learn occurs in a work setting. So the question here is whether and how employers recognize learning that occurs outside of those degree programs. So there are two things that I want to highlight about the data that we see here. First, both employers, you can see in the green bars, both employers and workers value skills and work experience the most. They say that's what's most important among those three categories. In all three cases, we get 85% or more of workers and employers saying that skills and work experience are very or extremely important. Second, interestingly, there's kind of a big gap between workers' belief that education is important and employers. Workers believe that education factors are a lot more important. More than 50% say that education factors are important compared to 24% of employers. So in a sense, employers are conflicted. In spite of the ubiquity of degree requirements, most of them are actually saying that they primarily care about skills and work experience. So this data, I think, suggests that both workers and employers should be open toward a shift to skills-based hiring and learning. So our second topic for this month is perspectives on employer-provided education benefits. So, even in a down economy, employers continue to be interested in sponsoring learning in order to attract, retain, and develop their talent. So on this topic, we asked whether employer-sponsored learning would make you more likely to accept a job or stay with an employer. And we found that irrespective of education level, around 2 in 3 workers said it would. So it is important to them. We then asked where they would prefer that this learning take place: with your employer, at a college or university, a non-college training provider, or learning independently, learning on your own. And there are a couple of interesting points that I want to highlight here. First is that the preferences are diverse. Every category had at least 10% saying that it was their preference. And so there's not a one-size-fits-all. If you're an employer trying to facilitate education and training, you've got to offer a wide variety of options that are going to suit the needs of all learners. Second is that a substantial share of Americans, about 2 in 5, want to learn in a setting in which their employer is involved in facilitating. So we see between employers or partnerships with colleges, between colleges and employers. And the third, we did see an interesting difference across education levels here. And it's specifically that Americans without college degrees are twice as likely to prefer non-college training providers and 50% more likely to prefer learning on their own in comparison to college degree holders. And then finally, the question that always comes up in these conversations is, this all sounds great, but who's going to pay for it? And that is who should pay for education and training. And so we asked our survey respondents to assign a specific percentage, and they could say anything between 0 and 100% to each of these categories: the share of education and training that should be funded by state and federal governments, individuals and their families, and employers. And so what I'm showing you here is the average of those. And so what we see in the end is that Americans believe that the funding of education and training should ultimately be a shared responsibility. And that's true irrespective of education level. We did have some outliers who said it should have been, 100% of or entirely funded by one category or another, but by and large, Americans agree with the notion that this is a shared responsibility. So with that, as always, I want to encourage you to follow up with us at consumervoice@stradaeducation.org, or you could visit our Public Viewpoint webpage at stradaeducation.org/public viewpoint, and you can go and explore these data ourselves and view the results from prior months. But I do want to offer a few more thoughts before we hop into the panel discussion here from Patti and Martin. Number one, with respect to skills-based hiring, I think that this is often framed as a false choice, meaning that if you favor skills-based hiring, you're against degrees. But on the contrary, we know that the returns to learning are high and they continue to grow. So and degree programs are the most traveled pathway to develop skills, and the bachelor's degree, for example, is the gold standard of that. So it is possible that to both encourage more Americans to complete degrees, as well as provide opportunities to workers who don't have those degrees, but have acquired the skills through some alternative routes. The second is that, kind of the $1 million question here, which I haven't touched on, but I'm sure we'll get into it in the panel discussion, is how do you validate skills or learning more generally? And just a couple things on that. One is credentials as they exist today have their own set of problems. I think a few weeks ago, certainly within the past month, Credential Engine reported that there's nearly 1 million different or unique credentials in the labor market. Many people, many workers have multiple credentials. So there is this Tower of Babel issue with the explosion of non-degree credentials in particular over the past decade. It's very hard for employers or workers or anyone to really make sense of this. And it is one of the reasons that companies are more and more offering their own credential. And then the other piece of this is there has been this great deal of innovation in pre-hire assessments, which have the potential to expand opportunities to this population of skilled workers without degrees. And Martin, I know, has done some research on this, some really great work on the landscape of those pre-hire assessments. It's an incredibly challenging problem with, not an easy fix, but there are alternatives to degree-based hiring that are being embraced more and more. And then the last thing I'll say here is that promoting opportunities for skilled workers without degrees, I think, has been an underrated strategy for the end of promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've heard from employers who've said, if I only hire workers with degrees, it's simply not going to be possible to achieve my goal of hiring a diverse workforce. So in addition to helping workers reskill and upskill, how we identify talent is an essential element for how equitable this recovery is going to be. And so with that, thank you. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Lots to chew on there. I'm just going to very briefly give our experts brief bios and then get into the discussion. Martin Kurzweil leads Ithaka's Educational Transformation Program, which is focused on students' post-secondary access and success. Some of the topics Martin works on include predictive analytics, proactive advising, adaptive learning platforms, course redesign, alternative credentials, accreditation, big data ethics, and the process of institutional change. Martin previously oversaw school evaluation and research for the NYC Department of Education, which I did not know. But I did know that when I was inside higher ed, I heavily cribbed from Martin's work at Ithaka, particularly on alternative credentials. Patti Constantakis leads the Walmart Foundation's Equitable Talent Systems portfolio, which seeks to engage employers in more equitable hiring and advancement practices. She previously worked at Digital Promise, a nonprofit group where she focused on using technology to build the literacy and numeracy skills of our lowest skilled frontline workers. She also developed a competency-based digital skills program for non-traditional adult learners and workers. So let's start with Patti. Obviously, Walmart has a lot going on in the education and training spaces. Can you talk a little bit about your role with the foundation and then give us an overview of the various projects Walmart has going on?
Sure. And I want to thank you guys for having me today on this webinar. and yes, so as Paul said, I lead our Equitable Talent Systems program at Walmart.org, which is the Walmart Foundation. And I think what's interesting about how Walmart, I would tell you a little bit about my role, so that because it reflects a bit about how Walmart in general works. So my role is really philanthropy. It's part of Walmart.org, the foundation, but that's one half of my role. The other half of my role is really as a consultant to the business, because much of the work that we invest in as a foundation is really about understanding and learning the kinds of things we're trying to do there. We're trying to learn so that we can actually incorporate them into our business. The business believes heavily in this notion of shared value. We believe that what's good for society is also good for business, and we want to actually act on all of that, in particular around human capital. So we believe that really investing in our workers is not only good for them and good for society, but in the end, it's also really good for business. We will do better if we do that kind of investing. So over the last 5 years or so, we've been really rethinking the way we do things. So we've been rethinking roles for our workers kind of all across the business. We've been rethinking career pathways. We've been really sort of we believe strongly in growing our own talent. So I don't know how many of you guys know this, but Doug McMillan, who is our CEO, started as a grocery, started in our Walmart stores as an associate there, and he's spent 25 years, and he's gotten, so that philosophy and that culture runs deep. What we discovered was, if we want those kinds of career pathways, we're going to need to invest in the upskilling and reskilling of folks as we go, especially as technology is changing the way we do business, period, right? So we discovered that all along the way, and we were like, okay, now what do we do about this? And so ultimately, right, and we can get into more, there's a whole lot I wanted to react to that Andrew was saying. I was like, oh yes, this. But let me just say that over those 5 years, then what we tried to do was really think deeply about that upskilling, reskilling piece, and how to do that. And we came up with 2 big programs that probably most of you have heard of. First is our Academies program, which is really geared towards our store level employees and growing their skills. And there's like 200 of them around the country. They are hands-on. They are integrated into the workday. It is very specific training that ultimately is designed to grow, ultimately to get you to promotion, to get you to be promoted from one place to the next. The nice thing about that program at this point too is that depending on the training that you're actually doing, you actually can get college credit for some of that. So that is really cool, and I'm like, I think that's cool. The second big program that, again, many of you may have heard of is our Live Better You program, which we affectionately call it's $1 a day for a college degree, which it actually is. That not only do we call it that, that is in fact the idea. We're partnered with Guild, and what Guild does for us is help us through their platform, allow our associates to really get both college degrees. You can get your high school diploma, you can get trade certificates and certifications. There's several things there. And we've got, I could go into more detail and perhaps we will in a bit, but that's the basics of what we offer at this point.
Thanks, Patti, and we will give you a chance to respond to Andrew's presentation. But first, let's turn to Martin, and if you want to give the lay of the land in response to some of what Patti said.
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and thanks to Strada for inviting me, and Andrew and Patti for those great opening comments. So as Paul mentioned, I lead the Educational Transformation Program at Ithaka SNR, and we study the efficacy and implementation of programs, policies, innovations that have the potential to help students advance their educational and career goals. And we have a particular emphasis on lower income and BIPOC students who historically have been underserved by higher education. So that's kind of the perspective that I bring to bear. And I thought I could start by complimenting Patti's introduction to the efforts at Walmart, which are, you know, a huge ecosystem unto itself with sort of the context, some of the broader conditions and trends, touching on some of the things that Paul and Andrew have already mentioned. So the first thing I'll just note is that the moment we're in, the COVID recession, is not like other recent recessions. So to state the obvious, we're still in the midst of a horrific pandemic that is killing thousands of people each day. It's restricting movement and the ability to do things face-to-face safely. It's massively disrupting schooling and childcare, something that I feel personally. And it's hard to imagine getting a lot of the people who've lost their jobs back to work without getting the pandemic under control. But as Paul explained, there are also some types of jobs that are not likely to come back at all, at least not in the form that they were in before the pandemic. And that is the acceleration of a shift in the need for training in different types of skills that's really been underway for a long time. Unfortunately, the pandemic conditions are also affecting the pursuit of education and training, which we typically see during recessions. So we're not seeing a surge in adults pursuing higher education as we've seen in other recent economic downturns. Instead, we're seeing huge declines in community college enrollment, in particular, community college enrollment was down about 9.5% in the fall, which is a huge amount. There are some programs that have seen an uptick in enrollment. Credit and non-credit programs offered by large-scale online providers, both for-profit and not-for-profit, and short-term certificate programs for career-focused credentials. Many of these share features that make them appealing in the current circumstances. They may be faster to complete, more flexible than traditional higher ed programs. They're perceived to be more job-related. The scale and variety of both types of offerings have increased significantly since the last recession, as Andrew mentioned. But while these programs have facial appeal, in practice, it is extraordinarily difficult for a learner to navigate the landscape of offerings on their own. There's just not good information and not accessible information to understand which have job market value, which are fairly priced, et cetera. While we don't have a lot of data from this current period, we do know that in the recent past, the pursuit of non-degree credentials and learning experiences has tended to replicate or even exacerbate inequality. To put a point on it, Black and Latinx women have been much more likely to obtain the non-degree credentials associated with the lowest earnings, things like certificates in cosmetology and certain healthcare certificates. And by contrast, white and Asian men have been much more likely to obtain non-degree credentials associated with the highest earnings, like certifications in IT or manufacturing. It's also worth noting that those higher earning credentials have tended to be stacked on top of associate's or bachelor's degrees. The people earning them already have those degrees, while the lower earning credentials have been earned by people without degrees, and those credentials often don't help them make progress towards their degrees. They don't stack. So as interest in these alternative programs peaks, what can we do to avoid these inequities that we've seen in the past? Well, I think we just heard a great example from Patti. For those who work for a large employer, the employer can play a highly effective role in helping folks navigate this landscape. So Patti explained some of the ways that Walmart is curating credit and non-credit opportunities for its workforce, encouraging and financially supporting participation, helping team members shape a pathway, an educational pathway, but also a career pathway. And to be frank, Walmart is a leader in this area. There are a number of other large employers who are engaged in similar efforts, though. Now, there is a risk, of course, that this employer investment in employee education will go away as the employer's economic incentives change. I will say, though, that one of the surprises of the COVID recession for me is that the large employers who had developed these programs prior to COVID have not dropped that benefit. And indeed, some have started new ones or significantly expanded their efforts. So that is a good sign. Now, what about those without a job or those who work for an employer without the capacity to provide the kind of educational pathways that Walmart and others provide? The most promising arrangements that I've observed are regional collaborations among state and local governments, employers, workforce boards, higher education institutions to provide and fund a similar set of pathways. So just to name a few examples, the state of Indiana has developed an effective set of programs over a period of years, largely focused on manufacturing. The DC area has an interesting consortium that has helped to define pathways into technology jobs that are in high demand in the region. And Sacramento has gotten some recent attention for using CARES Act funds to pay unemployed workers to complete short programs in IT, data science, and other fields with willing regional employers involved from the outset. Well, that one is relatively small scale. It is noteworthy because of its earn while you learn model. They're paying folks to participate in these programs. So there's some promising programs out there. I'd say at this point there are far too few to help people keep up with changes in demands for skills. We need more. We need them at greater scale. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion to dig in some of the details and talk about some of the ways that that greater scale might be achieved.
Thanks, Martin. I want to pass it back to Patti to respond to any of that or Andrew's piece. I've got a couple specifics for you, but I'm guessing you may have some thoughts you'd like to share.
Sure, but I'm happy to hear that, I'm not sure the best way to do that, given you have questions, and then I'm like, oh, but mostly in response, Martin, I agree with everything you say. There's not much more to say. Like, we need so many more types of programs. I completely agree on the worry around non-degree credentials, right? Where does that put us? And I think the one thing I would say, as I sit here representing an employer, is there's a role that employers need to play there as well, right? It's, do we need that degree? And if we don't, can we do a much, much, much better job at signaling? People use the word signaling. What are the skills that we actually need for these jobs? And, many of us, and we're going through a process right now at Walmart where we're really kind of looking hard at that. And it's hard. It's not easy work to try to boil it down to what are the skills. And so but I think it's crucial that we all do it so that we can actually shift to a more equitable system here.
I had a question, Paul, do you mind if I jump in here on the non-degree? Just a question for either Martin or Patti. I'd love to, Martin, the way you framed the non-degree discussion is, women going into cosmetology versus men going into higher demand fields, usually in IT, STEM, so on and so forth. I wonder why that conversation tends to stop at non-degree when we, at least the data I've looked at, when you go to the degree level, that dynamic remains the same. Women going into early childhood education, for example, versus men more likely to go into the STEM BAs or that sort of thing. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions there. Women going to healthcare BAs tend to, have higher wage field. But whether you look at it at the BA level or the AA level or non-degree credentials, you see those same sort of differences in terms of, differences in field. There's a whole pipeline of this happening. And then once you get into the labor market, you see that it's the same sort of phenomenon that are driving the differences. So I'd love to hear if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, and I mean, not to mention the, disparities among women and men who have the same credential, Black and Latinx people and white people who have the same credential. And I think you're right, Andrew. And I guess what I would say is that the short-term or non-degree credential market as it exists now isn't a counter to the sort of broader hierarchy of inequities. It's not disrupting that. It's perpetuating it in a lot of ways. Paul, I don't know if you had a question or if I should.
Yeah, I mean, Patti, anything you wanted to add there? I mean, and to note also that the job loss has been felt much worse by women and Black and Latinos as well. Nope. All right. So let's go to we've gotten a bunch of questions from the audience about verification, the Tower of Babel question. We're talking with scale here at the highest level, an employer that can do a lot, that can influence, entire industries and economies. Could you talk a little bit, Patti, about how the academies and Live Better U can best ensure that the credentials that those employees get have value elsewhere? Now, I know Live Better U, we're talking about degrees, which have value, of course, outside of Walmart's purview. But what do you do to try to make sure that not only the skills training leads to promotion opportunities within the company, but if employees leave, those skills can be translated and understood by other employers or even colleges that are looking for prior learning credit?
Yeah, it's a great question because, we get often the question around whether or not we would be sad. Sad is not quite the right word. Whether we would not be happy with the fact if we were, spending all this money on training folks and then they leave right away. And our answer is actually, that's great. That's fine. That again plays into our notion of what's good for that worker is also good for society and also good for us, right? So philosophically, we're trying to approach things that way. It's more difficult in the actual operationalizing of all of that, right? So in the academies in particular, there is an attempt really to do a couple of things. One is to sort of think about the skill sets that we're training from a broader perspective than just our stores. Now, obviously, some piece of that has to be about here's how we do it at Walmart, right? But there's plenty in there that's around management at a whole level, or logistics specifically, et cetera. So there's plenty that's that, and many of those actually have. We can get into the digital badge conversation if we want to, but that is we specifically try to design something that results in a digital badge that you can take with you from here. So that's kind of number one. But we in the LBU part of what we do is we also are thinking through what are the right non-degree. So we do have these skilled trade certificates that way, and we're partnering with Penn Foster on some of this. We're partnering with Southern New Hampshire University on some of the digital skills pieces and the IT pieces. And so we're in search of also partners that we can work with that would actually either help us with the stackable credentials or credentials that clearly align with the career pathways that one could engage in at Walmart, but also go elsewhere, right? So we're trying to take that lens on everything we do.
And while I'm with you here, 2U, one of the prominent online program management companies, just announced that Guild, your tuition benefit partner, will be doing short-term credentials with them. So lots of short-term credentials coming from lots of different places. As Credential Engine says, there's a million credentials out there. What's possible? I know that's maybe not a fair question, but could you get to the place where Walmart could have badges stacking up to a full-on degree at some point? I mean, what's your ambition, I guess, in that space?
That's a really good question, because it depends on who you ask in the space, right? So I would, can't frankly say from a business point of view, we're less concerned about the degree and more concerned about, are we building the skills that people need for the future, in particular, as we do this digital transformation in our business in particular, right? So we're probably more concerned about that. How do we equip them with the skills, and less concerned about, like, does it stack to a validated degree? We understand, though, that the world also, like, that has value in the world as well. And so if we can provide that opportunity as well, we probably will, right? So it's not, I don't know that there's not one ambition, it's kind of both. What can we do well for that work?
No easy answers here. Wish there were. So with partners like Southern New Hampshire that also have scale, I would assume that employees who seek out credentials would be more likely to have their knowledge, skills, and abilities recognized. I'm talking about their work experience at Walmart recognized by some of these scalable partners. Is that a fair assumption?
Probably is, but we're trying to work towards more than that, right? I mean, we can go down, I can bring up topics around learning and employment records that we're like, you guys have heard of that work, which is really about a record, both of your learning and your work experience. It's to simplify it, I suppose it's, a newfangled resume, as it were, but we're trying to engage in that as well, in terms of getting our training into a mode where somebody can actually take that and have it be recognized elsewhere as well. So it doesn't get stuck with them at Walmart, and it means something outside of Walmart.
Martin, I'd like to ask you to respond to some of that. When you think about the challenge of getting these credentials recognized outside of employers or across institutional boundaries, what are some of the best practices you're watching in terms of standardization and validation? Where does it need to come from? Another easy question.
It's an incredibly complex and challenging implementation, as Patti identified. I do think that, so Patti mentioned earlier the articulation, the clear articulation of the skills needed for particular positions. I would add to that the ways in which those skills are demonstrated or assessed. So it's both defining them, but also explaining how they are measured or evaluated in an individual. And I think that is the building block, right? That's the building block for stacking, is what is the sort of outcome, and how do you assess it, and how can that be compared to other outcomes that are assessed in other ways. Since most people engaged in education and training are doing so with the goal of advancing their career, I think that getting that signal, to use Patti's word, from the employer at the outset is really important. I think it also takes well, if you think about it, and it's in sort of the in a sequential sort of way, to stack from individual skills and credentials up to something like a degree, which should be a broader and more durable signal of learning and engagement and adaptability. You need to understand what skills and knowledge the person has already. So some kind of prior learning assessment to know sort of what's in the tank already. You need to know what the destination is. So what sort of degree or what sort of combination of skills are you trying to get to? And then you need to map a pathway between those two things. And there are some higher education programs that have gotten very good at that in the degree completion context. So Southern New Hampshire has already been mentioned. There's also Thomas Edison State University, a public university in New Jersey. There are others, but that's sort of the process that they go through, right? They define the bucket that is the outcome. They see what folks have done before to date, and then they map out the steps in between. So that's what I would say. I would point to a few examples and sort of comment on the overall process, but it is the devil is in the details, as I'm sure Patti knows all too well.
Paul, if I could make a quick plug here, our affiliate CALE, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, in partnership with WICHE, the Western Interstate, I can't remember the rest of it, higher education, but released a report back in November that showed, with respect to prior learning assessment, that it's so valuable and such a big part of the solution here in terms of stackability, in terms of giving people credit for what they've already learned. They showed what they showed in the report was that it increases completion rates, saves time, money, and also promotes persistence from the perspective of the college. And so I encourage you all to go check that out.
Thanks, Andrew. So let's switch gears briefly here on skills-based hiring. I'll start with Martin here. Obviously, a lot of noise here, particularly big companies in IT talking about moving beyond the degree in hiring. The federal government under the Trump administration prioritized skills-based hiring over degrees. I think IBM says 15 to 20% of their new hires fit this kind of new collar category. How serious is this, Martin, this time around? You've been tracking these issues for a while. Is this going to stick around for a while, do you think? I hate to make anyone make a prediction, but I mean, how seriously should we take this move?
Yeah, I think at this point, it's still more of an aspiration than a reality in most circumstances, but I do think there's serious movement in the direction of skills-based hiring. It all comes down to implementation, and in a lot of cases, the way that skills-based hiring is implemented is not very sophisticated, right? So for most firms, I would say skills-based hiring is implemented as a resume keyword search. So it's coming up with a set of words that are meant to signal the kinds of skills that the hiring manager has identified, and looking for people who put those words in their resume. It is still the case that degrees and certain high value industry credentials are requirements in a majority of job listings, even where that kind of skills-based hiring is happening. Now, at the cutting edge, companies like IBM and others are using a variety of nuanced, usually situation-based performance assessments in their hiring process as a way to directly assess and identify skills, even if they're not apparent from the experience or credentials of a candidate. Very few employers are doing that at the top of the hiring funnel. It's much more common in the middle of the hiring funnel. So after there's been some weeding out, sometimes based on requirements like a degree requirement, but not always. But the part of the reason for that is concern about labor and employment law and sort of using these assessments in lieu of the sort of more traditional means of sorting candidates. I'm not sure that the that the evidence really supports that, but that's the sort of the risk assessment that a lot of firms are making about where and how to use these kinds of assessments. I'm really interested to know how Walmart approaches skills-based hiring.
Well, okay, so let's talk about it. So again, philosophically, we are in a place where we understand that skills for us get us to those career pathways, I think is how we see it. We actually, funny enough, don't like we have done a scrub through a lot of our job positions, and if they don't require a degree, we don't require a degree. Like our store managers, there's no degree requirement for a store manager. So we just start there, and then there are a couple other places. But I would actually say that what we've seen, our business seems to more clearly understand how skills can help us towards developing those career pathways that I was talking about. So what's happening, what we're doing internally is we're looking at our job postings and our job requirements from an internal point of view, and really we are trying to break out the skills, and we're doing that because we want to create the career pathway, right? So from a I'm trying to figure out a store, from a logistics point of view, right? As you climb out of the store into one of our distribution centers and work in logistics, what are those skill sets and what does that career pathway look like? The hope is if we do all of that work, then that also then translates as we start to bring people in. We have a little bit more knowledge, like the assessment piece is still kind of an issue, Martin, to be candid about that, because internally it's easier to understand where they came from. So and have a pretty good sense of like, yep, that's a skill set you would have if you have got to do that. Harder to do if you're bringing somebody in from outside. But we're doing it across. I mean, we're a huge company and a whole lot of roles. But there is a concerted effort to move towards skills-based everything. So hiring, promotions, advancement, learning. So all of it is there. But I will say it is. There are moments when it feels completely overwhelming, and that's the kind of that's the feedback that our HR team gives others. That it's like, it is super overwhelming, but just take it a little at a time, because we believe in the equity of it. Ultimately, we really do.
Great, thanks. So turn into an audience question here, building on Patti's comment about the public good of investments in training and development. The question is, what are your thoughts, Martin? We'll start with you, about public investment in this space. Not an easy one, again, but briefly, what would you like to see? What do you think could be coming down the pipe that could help from a public investment standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hot topic. I think, one thing I think is necessary is a lot more federal support for states, which are, as we know, are suffering right now budgetarily, and a lot of the programs to help connect unemployed people to training, to help connect people to jobs, are run at the state or local regional level, but the funding comes through the state. And this is not the time when we want states to roll back those programs. It's time when we want them to expand them and improve them. And I also think that funding, that federal support for states, could be a mechanism for reinforcing some of the more effective practices in workforce development. So attaching conditions to some of that spending to promote the kinds of collaborative arrangements I talked about a little bit earlier, bringing in employers, higher education, workforce, and so on. Another, I think, important public investment, which is really more in the infrastructure, is to try to break down some of the silos that exist between workforce, higher ed, P-12, K-12, as it used to be known, education, which are funded separately, have, different agencies or sub-agencies involved at both the federal level and the state level. And that creates duplication, it creates inefficiency, it doesn't allow for thinking about the support for an individual's learning and career development as a continuum, as a sort of integrated whole. And so changing the structure of that policy space in a way that allows for more integration, I think, would be really important. Another area that I would flag for public investment is improving the quality of data on the huge number of different kinds of credentials that are out there, and education and training programs that are out there. That's the basis for a better understanding of the landscape. It's the basis for quality assurance in the space, which I think is really needed. There's been a lot of debate about making shorter term certificate programs and other kinds of programs eligible for use of federal financial aid. And, I think that having better data collection and quality assurance would be a necessary condition for doing that, but it could be a condition for doing that, right? That could be the way to start to build a better information set.
So as I feared, we were going to run through our time pretty quickly with this collection of topics, but I wanted to briefly, in the lightning round fashion here, turn to Patti. If you want to respond to public funding, please do. But I'm going to combine a couple questions here. One saying, is Walmart's attention to skills-based hiring maybe a new form of corporate social responsibility that others could follow? And another question kind of reminded me of that, saying, how can Walmart's suppliers or its influence more broadly help other smaller companies get on this bandwagon writ large? And it's a lot of, I think some of the questions realize that Walmart's under, it has to do a lot of the leadership here, but how can we get other companies involved, basically?
Yeah, what I would say is, I think we somewhat recognize we understand that our size has a certain kind of signal. And so, yes, part of, I think, what we want to do is lead and get and show, here's what we're doing. Like, we're happy to talk in forums such as this one and in others to say, we're tackling it and here's how we're doing it. And it is not as straightforward as we would all love it to be, but we're on this journey. Will you join with us? So there have been, we've led through like some of the efforts that the Business Roundtable is doing, right? There's a whole new initiative called Multiple Pathways Initiative, and we've got over 80 companies who sit on the Business Roundtable who are engaged in what it takes to do skills-based hiring, specifically because we believe in the equity piece of all of that. So it's those kinds of efforts. We're also trying to, through our philanthropy, we're also very much trying to, how can we be a voice and how can we support the kinds of efforts that are going to continue to change the system? So we're trying to do both, and are hoping to, encourage many others to join us. So, yeah.
Well, that's a good last thought for us here. Thank you, Patti. Thank you, Martin. Patti, anyone who can get a chance to see what Walmart's doing with the academies, like I had the good fortune to do, should really do it. It's pretty amazing work. So we'll be watching what you're doing, Martin. I hope we can keep in touch on all of your thoughts about this fast-moving and complex space. Thank you for all of you for tuning in. We hope this has been valuable. We appreciate your feedback on how we can continue to be of service to the field through future public viewpoint webinars. A link is being added, or may already have been added, to the chat. It'll take you to a survey to add your thoughts, and we'll also email a link tomorrow with a follow-up note with the recording of the webinar. That's it. Thanks all. Have a good one.